Simardone as a guest. I'm Aidan Simardone as a geopolitical analyst. I'm an immigration lawyer. As a Master of Global Affairs from the University of Toronto, and his writings has appeared on Newsweek, Jacobin, and the Cradle Media. I guess during our conversation, I think we will get to learn a little bit more about him as well. So, Aidan, welcome to Senay Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Aidan, obviously I saw some of your posts on Twitter and you're a geopolitical analyst, but we do know where we are globally now. Things are really heating up in the Middle East with what's happening in Iran. But I saw a few posts about about Sudan and generally in East Africa and especially in Horn of Africa. What is your general view with what's going on in on the Horn of Africa right now?
Yeah, everyone who's focusing on this, it's a bunch of interlinked, somewhat separate, but also interrelated conflicts going on. So anyone who even Westerners know, for instance, about the civil war in Somalia, that has also since 2011 taken on a new dimension with Turkey playing a greater role, I should say, in Somalia. And now we're also seeing, though, of course, we saw back in 2024, I believe late 2024, if my date is correct, maybe it was late 2025, the brief diplomatic conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia regarding Somaliland. Of course, Turkey, again, actually played a role in kind of diffusing that situation. We have even the tiny country of Djibouti. This is on the African mainland, geographically, I think the second or third smallest country by area, only
Mhm.
1 million people. But Djibouti is playing a huge role, obviously, the military bases, but now, of course, the Bab el Mandeb Strait. This is an area of water between Djibouti and Yemen, where I believe anywhere from 15% to one third of all container traffic passes through. The Houthis, who control the most populated areas of Yemen, and they are allied with Iran, they could cut off that region, for instance, and that would further spike the ongoing oil prices we're seeing, for instance, that are skyrocketing as of today. Then you have Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, beautiful country, lots going on. Everything from, of course, the potential escalation with Eritrea. The only thing I would note about that, though, is I've been hearing about this for 6 months, and it feels like every day it's going to happen the next day. And thankfully, there has not been a war with Eritrea yet. That's not to say it's bad what's going on, but it's just to say I wouldn't hold my breath over that, although that is a potential flashpoint. Tigray, of course, with of course, how would I phrase this? The war crimes that have occurred there. Ethiopia also mobilizing. But as I've also put on my Twitter before, there's also Ethiopia's facing issues because they've mobilized in around Tigray. But I'm sure, as you know, Senay, that of course this means actually less Ethiopian troops around the Amhara region, which then means that we see Fano militia, for instance, capturing a couple of villages. Now, to complicate things further, so this is going to be a very long answer, but to complicate things
Go
further,
ahead,
now
please.
we have Ethiopia, for instance, now intervening in the civil war. I mean, civil war in quotation marks. I would say this is just a United Arab Emirates backed genocide in Sudan, but the quote unquote civil war in Sudan, Ethiopia is now helping out the Rapid Support Forces, which is one of the sides of the conflict, a genocidal militia. But then to complicate things even more, we have in the last week, of course, now the United Arab Emirates, that is, for instance, getting hit by Iranian drones and missiles, which means that the Sudan conflict could actually change, in my opinion, for the better. So things could change there. Needless to say, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, then the area bordering Ethiopia and Sudan, the Bab el Mandeb Strait, Yemen. And we also have the United Arab Emirates Saudi rivalry, which was playing a huge role in the Horn. And now that's all changed because of the ongoing war of aggression against Iran. There's a lot going on there, and I think it's all very interesting. I do hope it turns out for the better. Unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is an overlap of conflicts going on and certain alliances forming that could actually turn this into a huge regional war.
Thank you very much, Aidan. This is actually very interesting because a lot of geopolitical analysts, news medias, whether mainstream or independent, I mean, whenever something goes on in the Middle East, usually, the focus entirely, I mean, also in Europe, like in case of Ukraine versus Russia, but especially in the Middle East is a huge, because of oil, because of, the religious tension that, almost everyone feels like part of because the Abrahamic religions are, cover almost all over the world globally. There are
Hmm.
adherents across the globe. So it instantly became a global issue. But there are often very, very few people who actually directly connect what goes on in the Horn of Africa. And especially it has increasingly becoming extremely connected to a point where you cannot dissociate what goes on in North Africa, MENA, and East Africa, just
But
because.
I would say that's always been the case partly. I mean, look at, for instance, World War II. We like to think World War II started off with, for instance, Germany invading
Mhm.
Poland, but of course, the rise of Italian fascism couldn't have occurred without, for instance, the illegal colonization of what is now Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, of course. And the first defeats the Italian fascists were facing, for instance, was actually in the area of Eritrea. So the Horn has, this is what always happens. People pretend, the Westerners, people like myself, who usually look like me, pretend not to care about Africa. They say, oh, we don't know what's going on. Oh, it's not that important. It's always at the bottom of the headlines. But they care about African gold, African diamonds, African oil, African gas, cobalt in the Congo, uranium in Niger. So it's all an illusion. It's not that the higher ups of the power structure of the West don't care. They do care about Africa. They create ignorance deliberately so that people don't know what's actually going on. And so that's why I like to focus a lot on Africa. The Horn interests me a lot, but even in West Africa, I've written on Niger and
Mhm.
the Alliance of Sahel states, etc. But this has always been the case. Africa is treated as a second thought, but really it's actually at the top of every
Yeah,
European's mind.
absolutely. That's actually what I found interesting. I have, as an Ethiopian, I have to do a very quick inserted correction. We do take the 5 years the Italians took over as occupation and not colonization, similar way as the Nazis took over France, but the resistance
There
kicked
you go.
them out.
Exactly.
I would be eaten alive if I don't correct that. But
Mm. I
I'm
mentioned Eritrea,
coming
but the
back.
Ethiopians too, of course. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. But coming
exactly.
back
Absolutely.
to
Thank you.
our topic, what really interested me, especially increasingly recently, why it became more connected. You are absolutely right. Africa being all very obscured, it's not being geopolitically analyzed or regionally in a regional context. Everything is like, okay, African problems, African solutions. But in reality, we do know Western African hemisphere is really, really very well connected with what goes on in France, especially with the French speaking countries because of their financial system being connected, the economics, etc. South Africa with the UK, US, etc. With East Africa, anything that happens in East African nations, it used to be seen in a very siloed way, in a very individual way,
Mm.
because to be honest, in East Africa, there wasn't a lot of major players being involved. But what I see recently is, and in my view, you know how in the Western Hemisphere, obviously globally as well, superpowers like the US and even like, proxies of Israel and Israel, so they involve in areas and you can clearly see what happens in the Middle East, what happens, elsewhere, like in Latin America, when something happens in Colombia or Venezuela, you can kind of think in a train thread connected with the US. In the Eastern Hemisphere recently, there are nations like UAE that are almost acting like how Israel or US would act, like, collecting proxies all over the place, getting special rights to a nation's resources, real estate, water rights, ports, through unregulated access to funding. So I'll give you a very specific example with Ethiopia. Ethiopia was a strange, we were in a strange situation, like you said, where, so because of the Somaliland issue, Turkey used to support the Ethiopian regime with drones and other artillery, but it immediately stopped that because of what happened in Somaliland, because Turkey is a great ally of Somalia, and also, with the Eritrean axis, etc. So when that happened, the regime in Ethiopia has increasingly become dependent on the UAE. And that is not just, I mean, it's obviously a lot of our military cargoes coming into Ethiopia. We do know that. We monitor that as human rights advocates about what goes on in Ethiopia. And it's not just that, like financial aid that's not regulated by the Ethiopian parliament or Congress or House of Representatives directly, that given access to the prime minister office, like access to mining, etc. And now it got to a point where, its connection through RSF, even to a point of providing training camps. And my specific question I want to discuss with you, or I want to get your opinion on, is that, like earlier when you discussed the entire Horn of Africa situation with Ethiopia, I mean, for me, it wasn't too obvious in terms of how the regime is trying to externalize the situation. You've mentioned the Tigray situation, but like the war in the north, the northern Ethiopian war, started November 2020 and ended to November 2022 after the almost the failed Praetorian Agreement. After that, after 3 months, the war on Amara started, like immediately. Just there was only 3 months break, which means Amaras were at war for continuously for 5 years. But when you see the international news coverage during the time of the Northern War, and then the entire 3 years until the current, complexity started in Horn of Africa, there was almost no coverage. And
Mm.
sometimes it gets you. Is it because, because the political cliques in Tigray were in power for the previous 27 years before the current regime came? So it makes sense to have a huge connections, diplomatic access, etc. News access. That could be it. But the entire 3 years at war and not being covered at all. And now when
Mm.
flights are interrupted to Tigray, immediately the international media erupted again. And do you have any view in terms of that? What do you think stifles the news about the different complexities within Ethiopia? That's one question. But the second one is, a lot of people think that the Ethiopian regime is miscalculating, involving itself with the RSF. But I do say that it's not miscalculation. It is playing a trump card, because if the situation in Ethiopia is out of control, Ethiopia is becoming ungovernable. If this ethnic system falls apart, Abiy's regime won't be able to control the country. So in my view, if they can't control it, they would rather balkanize it and get whatever the
Mm.
little nation states they want to govern. So is this miscalculation involving such dangerous forces like, the leaders of the past, Janjaweed, etc.?
Yeah.
Or is it because they are forced by powerful allies like UAE? That's a question I have for you, because I personally believe that this is obviously calling a lot of uh, drawing in the action on your land, so that it gives you the right to do things that you don't normally are not allowed to do, like war crimes, etc. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So to answer your first question on why Tigray got more coverage than Amhara, I have no idea. I'm sorry to say, I don't know. Like the look, I follow these. I do follow these conflicts very closely. I, of course, am very familiar with the region. That's probably something you can lighten me on. I think that you're right. The Tigrayan people were at one point had the power in Ethiopia. Maybe that's why better connections, etc. I would have to look more into that. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, why that's the case, and sometimes, it's power. Sometimes it could be, I don't know, something to do with religion. Although I know, of course, like it's sometimes very confusing. Before Gaza, before the genocide in Gaza, for instance, there was a genocide of 120,000 Armenians in Azerbaijan. This is something I've written on. I've actually written 3 or 4 articles on this. Why did that not get coverage? And that was funny, because not funny in a funny way, but like in a strange way, because these were actually Christians who were being massacred. And so it was actually surprising not to see that covered in the West. The West usually loves covering when Christians are being affected. And you can correct me on this, but I believe that most Amhara people belong to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church,
Yeah.
if I'm correct, right? So
Yeah.
why is that not getting covered? I really don't know. To your second question regarding the calculation around Ethiopia's support now for the RSF in Sudan. So you're saying, I think that not from an ethical or moral standpoint, but from a strategic standpoint, does this make sense? I think, unfortunately, it does make sense in a way. I actually think the goal of Ethiopia is to destabilize Sudan. I think we have, of course, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, as you and your viewers are definitely aware of. It's only, I think, I don't know, 50, 10 kilometers away from the Sudanese border. If Sudan was able to get stuff together and to become a country that was strong, it might attack the GERD. That might be something it does, you know. I don't think that's I'm not gonna say it's like that's descriptive. I'm not endorsing that. I'm saying that's something it could maybe do. Maybe. So Ethiopia's goal then, I think, is to continue to keep Sudan in a state of war, of quote unquote civil war, of having this RSF militia continuing to genocide the people of Sudan. But this is where I think that, and so that calculation from a strategic standpoint makes sense. I think the issue, though, then comes what happens if this doesn't work out. So the RSF, I've written an article on this. The RSF is facing setbacks. They've been facing setbacks for quite a while now. What Ethiopia is trying to do is open a front in the Blue Nile region of Sudan. This is the area of the south of Sudan that borders Ethiopia. There were initially some assessments that this was going to go really quickly. You know, the same thing with the war in Iran. Yeah, it's going to take a couple of days. And the prediction was they're going to be capturing major cities in Blue Nile. It's moving very slowly there with the RSF. And I think Ethiopia miscalculated because I think inevitably the RSF is one day going to be gone out of Sudan. The reason why I assess this is because they were already facing setbacks for quite a while. They're going to face further setbacks because, of course, now we are in the situation where the United Arab Emirates itself is under attack from Iran. So how is the United Arab Emirates going to get machine guns, anti-ballistic missiles? How are they going to get all that to the RSF? I think you could actually see a very quick turning against the RSF. And then what happens then? Well, then Sudan will no longer have the RSF, and they'll be looking at Ethiopia and thinking, why did you do this to us? Why did you do this to us? And so I think it was a bad calculation. I think from a strategic point of
Very
view,
quickly,
go
yeah,
ahead, please.
very quickly on because I want to reflect on like this other angle I want you to look at. So I have seen another analyst giving the same like the same, and it makes sense, especially when you look at it objectively from like a third point of view. But historically, we do know with GERD usage, it's usually the Egyptians say that that has been really a deterrent for water use in Ethiopia, especially the Nile use. Sudan hasn't been a major opponent. Even with the water calculation, how much water goes into evapotranspiration, how much Sudan uses, and what Egypt claims. The strongest claim always comes with Egypt, and any
Yeah.
direct diplomatic, the toughest partner to convince is usually actually Egypt. But on top of that, what I'm balancing with is this much amount of allying with a group that could cost you a lot, even if you win or destabilize Sudan, it wouldn't have a huge impact in how much you could gain in terms of safely using without fear using GERD. But let's take that as it is. Just looking at how the Ethiopian regime is handling or working with the Sudanese groups. Just in 2021, in the middle of the Northern War, the Ethiopian government was closely working with Al Burhan's side, SAF side of the group.
Hmm.
So you don't see long-term, kind of calculation, long-term planning of trying to destabilize Sudan so that we could use our natural resources. In fact, there is sort of a switch of alliance because currently Al Burhan's faction, the ACAF, is hosting TDF fighters at the same time, which is linked with the TPLF. But now there are some factions, there are some separations, so we cannot necessarily say the entire TDF force, the Tigrayan Defense Force, is necessarily directly controlled by the TPLF anymore. But there is definitely forces that they're hosting at the Sudan side. And also, Amara Fano forces are active in Metacal, which is the zone, the area that holds the GERD dam,
Yep.
the area that is one of the most prominent genocide hotspots because about 40% Amaras live in that zone, but it entirely denies their existence.
Yeah.
Both the local constitution and the federal constitution gives this to minorities, the entire region. So that has been a location where like thousands and thousands of people have been massacred to a point where now FANOs are organizing to try and defend themselves from the genocide. So it has become, and Sudanese forces have been active in that area way before even the Northern War. That's because of, I know a lot of people talk about RSF and the gold trade, that they sell a lot of gold. That's how they get access to arms. And of course, they also have significant mercenaries that come through from all the way from Western Africa and Central.
Hmm.
And even when UAE, like you mentioned, when UAE is being overpowered, RSF might see the end of the way, but we're not quite sure with, I don't know how much Russia would be involved. We don't know how things work with mercenaries, etc. But still, them access having with gold is a huge issue. So what I
It
wanted to
is.
tell you is we have the same parallel. The Ethiopian Defense Forces had access to gold from Metacal, which
Mm.
currently now funders are eyeing as well, because it's a resource that can self-sustain you. You don't necessarily have to depend on foreign, support.
Yeah.
So with that calculation, with almost the government forces themselves acting like almost like warlords with local resources, etc. With that information in view, do you think it is again a possibility of trying to win the internal turmoil, to be able to govern in a coercive way rather than protecting GERD? I'm not trying to put this into your view, and I'm not trying to push you into that, but I want you to look at this from this view, and what is your assessment in that?
In terms of, so is your question about how the, like, was your fundamentally your question
So
about the
my
internal?
question
Yeah.
basically is, again, it's not miscalculation. It's not necessarily being pushed. Even, I mean, a portion of it is being pushed by UAE to support RSF, but
Yeah.
also it is a matter of trying to juggle and have local authority have like kind of how do you call it, like strangle Amara Fanos, TDF,
Right.
other forces that
Right.
are against its state, by making sure they have allies that could help them by externalizing the issue, so that they would get a hand in controlling the resistance within the country as well, because things are fast becoming out of their control. A lot of places are being controlled by a lot of resistant fighters.
No, absolutely. Okay, so in to emphasize the role of the United Arab Emirates is not to say that Ethiopia doesn't have its own goals. You know, African countries are in, on a global level, always in a position of vulnerability because of the effects of European colonialism. But every African country, nevertheless, makes choices, sometimes by just personal wanting to get that bag of money or something like that. But often, especially in the Horn of Africa, there is geopolitics involved. Getting the RSF, supporting the RSF to I guess what you're saying is get troops into the region or to undermine the Amhara. Absolutely, I think that's the case. I think it's also really like it's a calculation that makes sense maybe in the short term, but I think it's just really stupid because at the end of the day, the RSF is losing. And so this is, and yes, there's gold and that the RSF can sell, although it needs airplanes to get the gold out, and all that those airplanes were going to Dubai, and now Dubai airport shut down. I don't think it's a smart strategy fundamentally. Let's forget even the ethics and morality of it, which I'm very opposed to. But I think in terms of Ethiopian strategy, very dumb. With Ethiopia, and you're going to agree. I'm assuming you're going to agree with me on this. And there needs to be a true federal system in Ethiopia. We don't want Ethiopia to balkanize. That is horrible. Look what happened to the Yugoslavia, right? Genocide. You know, the each country being on its own and therefore being much weaker. We don't want. I don't want to see necessarily a balkanized Ethiopia, right? So, but I think allying with the RSF, and again, as I said, you're going to, so you're talking about this balkanization, potential for balkanization,
Yep.
and the that chance. I again, as I've said, if Sudan is able to get stuff together,
Mhm.
it's not going to be friends with Ethiopia. If the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, wins, why wouldn't they? And I don't endorse this, but why wouldn't they take vengeance on Ethiopia for supporting the RSF? And why wouldn't they, for instance, actually take advantage of that potential for balkanization, right? And any control that Abiy can get over Amhara in the short run, I think is going to really backfire. So I think it's actually just a very stupid strategy. If I was advising Abiy, I'd just say no, don't. The RSF, I'd say, look, the RSF's losing. Do not ally with the United Arab Emirates to support the RSF. This is going to hurt you in a year or two.
Like you said, Eden, it's either a very stupid miscalculation, or when you're absolutely backed down an alley, when you've too much beholden onto some power, maybe you don't have a choice. But regardless, definitely what's going on in Horn of Africa, and my view is that um, the more stable each country it is, the bigger the chance for peace. I mean, this is just basic logic, right? And then the more, interest groups there are that benefit from chaos, from, disorder, then they're gonna push for that end rather than for the stabilization end. So with that, I know. One last question. Is that okay?
No, no, as many questions as you want. It's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Yep.
So, Eritrea. So this is you've been saying that there's a lot of warmongering in terms of, I know it's presented in a way of access to port. Sometimes it's logically presented in a way that landlocked countries suffer when they don't have access to seaport, etc. Some of the narrative sounds kind of benign, but most of the time, the weights pushed from the regime in Ethiopia is, I mean, already a country that is in turmoil in such a warmongering way. I don't know if I make myself clear.
No, you're making yourself very clear. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not presented in such a, a logical way, where you have two sovereign countries. It doesn't matter when Eritrea got their independence, whether it's, hundreds of years ago, or 3 decades, or a couple of decades, or a couple of years. Once you have become, like an independent nation, there are like ways of, negotiating access, etc. Right? Same way that you would negotiate downstream and upstream users when you have a water use, when you are a source of water. So, do you think, again, same questions that I'm posing? Do you think this is similar how the Somaliland situation just flared in such a way that, it immediately died down as soon as it drew a lot of superpowers, like a lot of
Oh, did the potential for war with Eritrea and
yeah,
Ethiopia draw
that's
it
what I
down
mean, like
because
just
of the,
similar to, yeah, the
yeah,
Somaliland case was pushed. The
right,
Eritrean
right.
case, do you think really the war, like
Uh,
the warmongering, is it really just a strategy positioning? Is this, or do you really think we're seeing Ethiopian regime gearing for a really like nation to nation cross-border war, the way you see
Yeah,
things?
I it's a really hard thing to say. So, okay, so let me give you some examples. And regarding the involvement of regional powers, I don't know if that's necessarily why we haven't seen war with Eritrea. It could just be that it's a bluff. It could also be that, for instance, Ethiopia needs to build up its army before attacking. Like, let me give you some examples. Like, I remember before they, so again, because I am following all international politics. So when, for instance, the United States went in and kidnapped Maduro in Venezuela,
Mhm.
they were building that up for like, I think like it was actually almost half a year. I remember hearing about this in August, right? So it could be, we haven't, as I said, like it felt like half a year ago there was going to be war with Eritrea. Thankfully, that hasn't happened,
Mhm.
but it could just be a buildup. In terms
Mhm.
of the involvement of regional powers, that could be the case too. I do think it's very interesting. We are seeing, for instance, again, actually the involvement of Saudi Arabia and Eritrea together. I believe, actually, if I'm correct, several months ago that Saudi Arabia was planning to invest maybe like $1 billion in Eritrea, something along those lines. We see, of course, China has had very close relations with Eritrea for a very long time. Regional powers could be making it more difficult for Ethiopia to invade. I would also say, though, a war with Eritrea in terms of trying to get access to the sea, again, a very stupid thing. Eritrea, if you look at the geography, just like Ethiopia, for instance, a lot of it's very mountainous. Eritrea, of course, fought a protracted war of independence against Ethiopia and won. And that, for instance, is something like, yes, Eritrea is a lot smaller, but so is Gaza. And despite what Israel has been able to do in Gaza,
And
they actually,
Ethiopians are not united for this cause. I mean, there's
no,
already a lot of
exactly.
turmoil.
Exactly. And, sometimes you can have a larger country attack a smaller country, but, look at Gaza. Gaza's destroyed. We all recognize that. But Israel actually wasn't able to capture all of it. They've captured 40% of it, but they have not been actually able to capture all of it, despite 3 years in the United States backing it up. I think a war with Eritrea would be a disaster. At best, and this is not something I endorse, at best, maybe Ethiopia could capture a couple towns, but in terms of pushing all the way to the sea, to Assab or something like that, or Massawa or wherever it may be, that'd be a disaster. And it might look a lot like, and this is the scary thing, and this is, because I don't want to see Ethiopia balkanized. So what is scary is, were Ethiopia to try engage in a full scale war of Eritrea, it would be very similar to the 1980s when the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan. This
Mhm.
was also a very mountainous region. The Soviet Union was a lot larger. They felt like they could do this, but that war grew and grew and became very unpopular, and was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union fell apart. So attacking Eritrea won't strengthen Ethiopia. It will weaken it, make it a lot more vulnerable. And you make a great point. Not everyone in Ethiopia even supports it, When you don't have that support, you get domestic opposition, you get uprisings, it never goes well. So again, a stupid, stupid thing. You know what Ethiopia needs to focus on? Ethiopia, what's doing really well? It has a high economic growth. Now, unfortunately, that's not being seen to everyone in the country, but it's something that to focus on. This is what China's done. China, we can disagree with China on certain things. China, for a long time, has had one of the highest economic growths for a long time. China has not fought a major war since 1979. It's been almost 50 years. And look at it, it's prospering, it's a regional power. That's the way you go at it. If you're attacked, you have to defend yourself. But, supporting the RSF, attacking Eritrea, threatening Eritrea. These are not smart decisions. It actually shows not how strong Abiy is. It shows how weak he is.
Aidan, that's exactly why I think I'm glad we tied it into exactly what you said right now. This is why I've always felt like, regardless of the neighboring country that is in question, whether it's Somaliland and port access through Somaliland, whether it's training RSF in the west of Ethiopia, or whether pushing for access to the Red Sea or Asa port. It is all posturing. The reason why I'm saying it's posturing is that Ethiopia, in all of 3,000 of years of our history, it's always the unity of the people that was the power behind why we were never colonized. Why, and this is against not just the recent history since Berlin Conference. I'm talking about war with Egyptians, like war with the Turks, war, during the jihad and the crusade time. And then right until, the second Italian occupation, the secret behind it, we're an African nation that don't produce our own arms. But the one thing we have is that there is and this is since the mid-centuries, we have the army that is, that is, directly, under the control of the monarch. That's the first line of defense. But whenever there is war on the nation, the rulers only have to call, what do you call it, like a call to action. That's all they
Yeah,
have to
yeah,
do.
call to action. Yeah,
It's tradition. This whole Fanoism is part of that tradition. People just
right.
really respond, and usually, it's not the state that buys you guns. It's not the state that trains you. So training, shooting, sharpshooting, all this stuff is part of the tradition. So
Mm.
even like the rulers for centuries, they don't even have to think of budget. So people sell their ox, their housing, and recently their vehicles, their businesses, for the call to action. So that sort of response is not going to happen for this warmongering that's going on with
Exactly.
this regime, because a for the last 35 years, that Ethiopianism, that's Fanoism, that has been practiced across the entire Ethiopia or Abyssinia, the entire empire, it's not holding on because of the ethnic division, which is a very,
Hmm.
very, very ugly system that was instituted at the same year Yugoslavia gave out because of similar system. I think it was very
Hmm.
stupid to do that while you have a real life example, states that have their own ethnic theme songs,
Yeah.
like, anthems. They have their own special forces, defense forces. You have to think what's going to happen. So anyway, coming back to where we are, I think it's posturing. But my question regarding this going forward, let's say it would have been possible if Eritrea was alone. But like you said, okay, the Ethiopian regime might think, okay, small nation, etc. But ever since the Saudi stance changed on Yemen, since there was a time when Saudi and UAE really bombed the hell out of Yemen together, right? And then
It didn't work. It didn't
yeah,
work.
and
It
then
didn't
that
actually.
actually changed immediately, and
Yeah.
like that Bab el Mandeb Strait that you spoke of, just like the Hormuz when it was cut off by Iran, it really affected a lot of oil and other.
Hmm.
But it may not be oil, but there is a lot of trade that goes on through that strait,
A
and
huge amount, 15 to, and sorry, I'm just going to interrupt because I've written
on
articles about
19%,
this.
right?
Yeah, it's 10 to, so in terms of the world's whole
Mm-hmm.
trade of just container ships passing through, I believe it's anywhere from 10 to 30% because everything is heading towards the Suez Canal. So it's like a huge amount. Again, remember how we started this off? Oh,
Yep.
no one cares about Africa, but then everyone
Yep.
cares about Africa, right? So
Exactly.
this is
And
exactly it.
people never ever thought, they never had to worry, not just the West, anyone who's interested in maritime movement, logistics, trade, etc. Even the Chinese belts and what was it?
Yes,
Belts
Belt and
and
Road. Yeah, Belt and
the
Road.
belt.
Yeah.
Yeah. never had to worry because on that Bab el Mandeb Strait, what you call the most powerful nation that is geopolitically very active and involved was just Egypt. Saudi was more into development and changing their modernizing their system. Eritrea, Yemen, they never really asserted a lot of their access. Of course, Djibouti being a base for the American forces and France. They're
Everyone,
already, yeah, everyone,
China.
China,
Yeah.
they're already protected there. But it is when, the Houthi started, acting against the Israeli ships and also really becoming very vocal, that became a situation, an area. And in, of course, Eritrea, there was a time when UAE and Saudi were also very much interested in the Red Sea port. But now, when you look at that Bab el Mandeb Strait, regarding the entire what's going on in Middle East, and let's just forget Iran for now, because in terms of Iran, UAE and Saudi are on the same side currently. But apart
Yeah.
from that, when it comes to Africa, UAE and Saudi are not on the same side. So through UAE, you can kind of say like US and Israel, there is sort of they are there in the proxy bubble.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and they will be happy even to a point of boots on the ground. They might be happy to involve on the Iran side of the hotspot, but on the Horn Africa part of this hotspot, I don't think they would directly involve. There is a
No.
history in Somalia. So, Ethiopia, when you look at the entire region, really, except for Somaliland, the entire Bab el Mandeb, sphere of, the nations around there. I know Ethiopia doesn't count because it's cut off because of that Eritrean land
Yep.
down up to Assab. But in terms of original power, you can say that, especially the airspace, etc., you can say it's within the area of influence. So when you look at that, except Djibouti, Somaliland, and Ethiopia, not many countries in that entire area are against Saudi or Egypt against that alliance. So the way things are. So when you look at
Mm.
it that way, it's going to be in the biggest country from Somaliland, Djibouti, and Ethiopia is Ethiopia. The airspace, etc. The only place where this side of the proxy could use, including Israel, is Ethiopia. So when you look
Hmm.
at it that way, don't you think the way Abiy positioned Ethiopia here is truly wanting the action to come onto that ground so that it would become a very good cover to win over what's going on locally? Because you're positioning yourself, you are the only country at the moment, like Ethiopia, your airspace can be used against, Yemen
Yep.
or whatever coalition that goes on
Mm.
through there, or Sudan. So what is your view in that? Like, is this still a miscalculation, or is this like
No,
a
it's
willing
interesting what you're
partner?
saying. Yeah, and sorry to interrupt you. It's interesting what you're saying, and actually you're providing me some a good perspective because my big focus on the Bab el Mandeb Strait has been Eritrea, Yemen, Djibouti, Somalia slash Somaliland, and what's going on there. What you're saying is, could Ethiopia, for instance, become the major player in terms of airspace and attacks on? So, for instance, were the Houthis to close the Bab el Mandeb Strait, how would the United States and Israel react to that? And could they use Ethiopia? I'm going to be honest, that's not something I've actually considered. But I'm going to add some bits to this. I think it's very interesting because there is not really. Israel has said it wants to establish military bases in Somaliland. It has not done so yet. And making a military base is not easy. It's very, very tricky to build a military base. That's the whole point. They're supposed to be secure, very expensive equipment. And the Houthis have said that as soon as Israel builds a military base in Somaliland, that it would attack those air bases. Eritrea, of course, Eritrea is not, you know, had some relations with Israel, but that's been cut off, especially when it comes to this new rift between Saudi Arabia and others versus Israel and the UAE. And Somalia is obviously, when we're looking at Somalia, the actual areas that Mogadishu controls, it's not actually quite where the Bab el Mandeb Strait is. And Djibouti, though, is very interesting. And I do have sources from Djibouti, which I will keep confidential. I've written an article about Djibouti. And what's very interesting about Djibouti is Djibouti is in a very unique, tiny country, but this is where the action's going on. There's a reason why they have a military base from almost every, like so many of the big countries. And just for your listeners, really quickly, that includes China, Saudi Arabia, I think the United Kingdom, maybe, although it could be wrong, France, Spain, I think, Germany even has a military base. Japan's only foreign military base. That's in Djibouti, right? Djibouti is also the only country in the world with both military bases from China and the United States. They're not too far away from each other. In fact, they probably see each other at the same coffee shops in Djibouti City. Djibouti is absolutely critical, but Djibouti does something very, very unique in terms of its international diplomacy and geopolitics. Djibouti wants to focus on one thing mainly, and that's piracy. That's why all these bases came up in Djibouti. It was to counter Somali pirates, right? So Djibouti actually does not, even though it has all these bases, it doesn't actually want to get involved in a large scale war. I wrote an article on this for a website called Responsible Statecraft. It actually does not want to get involved with the Houthis. I'm going to get back to the point of Ethiopia, but just bear with me. The reason why this is important is because the United States actually, when the Houthis closed off the Bab el Mandeb Strait, the United States asked Djibouti, could we use your bases for airstrikes against Yemen? And Djibouti said, no, you cannot do that because they don't want to get involved in war. Djibouti's a tiny country, doesn't want the Houthis striking them. So you have left me with some very interesting information because if not Somaliland, if not Djibouti, if not Eritrea, then who could play the role? Well, I guess it would be Ethiopia. Why not put a bunch of bases there and go ahead and attack the Houthis? It's not something I like. I'm not endorsing that. I think you make a strong point on why that might be the case. So that's very interesting. That's actually you. I have to warn you. I might write an article on this. I'll try to give
Oh,
you some
please
credit.
go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
interesting.
it is because nations that hold such bases, they have an advantage. They have an advantage over training, access to technology, access to code training, especially when, nations build a base. Of course, there is a question of sovereignty. There is a question of being seen as a puppet. All that is there. But there is also, especially if you have regimes like dictatorial ones that have problems within their country, there is an advantage to becoming a base to a superpower because A,
Yes.
the human rights side can be overlooked because of a
Yep.
national interest issue. So there is that advantage. And of course, there was a time when during the Obama administration, there was a drone base in Arbaminch, Ethiopia, for
Yep.
example,
I know
with
about
the
that.
war
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
Amar. It just
Yep.
got closed recently. Yeah, having bases have that advantage. And
And
then please, yeah, go ahead and reflect on that.
well, see, we talked about because look at as a geopolitical analyst, my job is not to be a philosopher, moralist, or theologian. My whole point is to make calculations based on how countries will advance their own interests. As
Mhm.
I said, it's allying with the RSF or helping the United Arab Emirates with RSF. I think that's stupid. Attacking Eritrea is stupid. Unfortunately, because I don't endorse it from a moral standpoint, but I do think that bases against the Houthis within Ethiopia would make a lot of sense. And unfortunately, you're right, it would actually help out the government in ways to get rid of concerns around human rights. You could even put these bases could serve double functions. They could, on the one hand, attack the Houthis, and on the other hand, they could then, once that war is done, be used to attack other Ethiopians, right? People who are, whether it's in Tigray or Amhara, who are against what the government is doing. So that's a very interesting thing. I think it's something for all of us to look
Yeah, I
out.
mean, I could give you a real life example where
Tell me, yes.
during the war on Amara time, a lot of the arsenal in Ethiopia, because of the USSR time, the Derg regime, the military regime before this, this current the ethnic federalism regime before 1990. For about 17 years, Ethiopia was under a socialist military regime, and
Yep,
very,
the
very,
Derg.
very,
Yep,
you know about that, a very strong connection with the USSR back then. So
yep.
a lot of the arsenal, the artillery in Ethiopia is either North Korean or Yugoslavian, that kind of East Europe, USSR area. And we actually, we don't get a lot of American. It's very, very, very rare. But during the war on terror, the war on terrorism alliances that the US had across the globe, during that time, there were some Humvees that came into Ethiopia. And I remember those being used against resistance in the Somali region. And
Yes,
also,
yes, yeah.
actually, in the capital, Addis Ababa as well, and some, armed vehicles that were donated for the Ethiopian police force as well. So that is just really the simplest example. A lot more
No,
can get an access, and that's why we also hope for a lot of the public diplomacy, a lot of the social media activism, and a lot of, getting experts like you into not just in the mainstream media, to places where people actually listen and view. The advantage is that to go people to people, public diplomacy, going beyond borders, because as more and more people understand what goes on in other nations, it's not, Ethiopians who can control the American government. It's not Americans or Canadians that control the Ethiopian or the Eritrean government. But
hmm.
as people understand what other nations want, then they can pressure their own government on behalf of their, people in other nations. So I think that public diplomacy is very important. That's why we're having this conversation is very
Yep.
helpful. My
Well, to
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, like, and maybe, this is exactly it. Diplomacy is important. People can't pressure Ethiopia, like, especially if I'm a Canadian, I can't tell Ethiopia what to do. I don't actually want to be in that position, especially as a person of European background. That would be just so bad. I think Europeans have been telling Africans enough of what they're supposed to do. I will say this: I do think diplomacy is good, but also pressure. Every government wants power, and when you start to challenge power with your own power, that can really scare them and actually get them to do what you want to do. If there's enough opposition in the United States, for instance, the war against Iran will end. Absolutely. And if there's enough opposition in Ethiopia, there won't be any war with Eritrea. So that's really important.
Yeah, the public pressure is very, very important. So let me ask you um, one final question so that we can wrap up. And this is really to do with um, uh, generally with Middle East, again, with the religious aspect of things. Like my point of view is that we have to absolutely separate religion from what goes on anywhere in any parts of the world, but especially with Middle East, it has been really portrayed as if it is just Jews versus Arabs. But
It's not. It's not.
when,
It's
yeah, a
not.
very good example for that is especially what we're seeing, the alliances that we're seeing now, how UAE acts versus Qatar, how they act differently towards Israeli positions, towards alliances with the US. But really, the most interesting is the relationship between Israel, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia. That is my go-to place to give an example, to tell people, religion is something else, especially the Abrahamic religions are like they're very much interrelated. And that's how, I don't want to go into the detail of it, but in a very
No,
naive, innocent way of things, that's how I believe Abraham Accords may work if it was framed in a very consensual way. You know what I mean? But what I'm trying to say is from an angle of where it's not necessary to separate these three major branches of the Abrahamic religion in order to pit people against one another. But let's
right.
forget that part of it. But with Azerbaijan being a Muslim country that has a direct a conflict with Armenia, and there has been ethnic cleansing that has been reported, and I know this because we closely worked with advocates of Armenian genocide when we were trying to
Oh,
expose the
great.
Amara genocide
Yes.
very
Yes.
closely. And at the time, Russia was supposed to also be supporting Armenia, but
Yeah.
they were posturing, but they were not
Yeah.
supporting that much because of their geopolitical interest in the area. And Israel, because of other issues, arms alliance, etc., was actually was okay with Azerbaijan. Whereas knowing what goes on in terms of genocide during Second World War in the Armenian case, you would have expected some kind of solidarity. In that sense of things, is it safe to say for people in Horn of Africa, just don't get into that kind of interest groups. Just see things from their political interest groups point of
Hmm.
view, because I see
Yeah.
there are a lot of very dangerous groupings, but just really naively taking, the religious side rather than really understanding what the national interest of each nation is involved is in.
It's it's actually really funny because I actually first got Twitter 4 years ago because I was really interested in the academic study of religion. So I think what's interesting about this is religion is always secondary. So it's not that religion doesn't matter, but you make a point. Religion is used to as it's an ideology, like not the personal faith or the public faith of people, but when states are invoking religion, they're doing it as an ideology to advance their goals. And you're making a really good point about this because it really is all about power, power first, so then things like religion, everything else second. There's only three majority Shia countries in the world. There's Bahrain, which is very tiny. Then there's Azerbaijan and Iran. Azerbaijan and Iran do not get along with each other. What's interesting is Iran, though, has a very good relationship with Armenia. This is a one of the first country, including along with Ethiopia and Georgia, to become Christian. Iran gets along pretty well with Armenia, actually, right? Religion is
Very
secondary. It's
interesting.
used to justify power. Look at, for instance, with regards to Israel. I mean, Israel, yes, there is, again, religion plays a role in ideology, but, there's, for instance, in the Israeli army, there are Circassians. Circassians are actually Muslim, and they are actually very pro-Israel, the ones that live in Israel, along with the Druze. This is a ethno-religious group that is across the region. A lot of Druze members, they're not these two people I just gave examples of, they're not Jewish, but they are supporting the they are Zionists. They are supporting Israel. And so I think likewise, religion it should not be the dividing line. This is it's not that religion is important. I actually think religion can, especially when going towards justice, these forms of theology that are about helping the poor and liberating the masses is great. But in terms of, oh, these people are attacking us because they're Christian, or these people are attacking us because they are Muslim, that is not the best way to look at things. And again, you're making a great example. I actually really appreciate you bringing up the example of Armenia. And I'm glad to hear that Amhara people and Armenians were talking because this was something I wrote about when
Mhm.
the genocide in Artsakh happened. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, no one was writing about it. That's how we actually started this podcast. I was
It was
saying
a very glossed over
it
situation,
was,
similar to
it
what's going
was.
on against Samaras in Ethiopia.
was.
I
It
agree. Yeah.
was. And I started writing on that. And I actually started writing on that not because I was fully an expert on Armenia, but I was very upset and no one was talking about it. So I know a lot of people from Artsakh now and Armenians. I'm actually not myself Armenian. It's just something I cared about. So these are good examples. And likewise, in this war with Iran, we might see Azerbaijan attack Iran. Azerbaijan, majority Shia, attacking other Shia countries. So it's not really religion. Again, it's not that religion doesn't matter at
It's
all.
a
It's always
perfect
secondary.
it's a
Yeah.
perfect example to push that, to really convince people what goes on around the world is really not like, of course religion matters for the people, for the faithful, but the nation, the rulers, the ruling apparatus doesn't necessarily they don't do it for the dogma. It's like it's national interest, it's a specific group interest. And what is very interesting is also Russia being Orthodox Christian and Armenia being Orthodox Christian. And
Yeah,
during that conflict, I remember there was a lot of lip service going on because I remember Russians were supposed to be on the border, on the neutral zone, but
disappointing.
they
So
ended up being
horrible.
moving themselves out and letting,
Horrible, horrible.
yes.
Yeah, I was
So
very disappointed in that. I understand again strategically, Russia was bogged down in a war in
mhm,
Ukraine. That's
yes,
why I didn't do that. But again, like I do draw a line with things. Like when it comes to
yeah,
genocide, I'm like I kind of think you have to throw out your strategic interests, and if you have any values whatsoever, if you don't want to just be a nihilist and believe in nothing, you have to come in and support any people who are facing genocide. And I think that was very again this could be a whole hour conversation, but I think that was very sad that Russia didn't step in and help Armenians out. That was horrible. I'm
that is.
still angry to this day about it because now there's
This is your last statement, the way you put it. I think it's a perfect way to close our conversation today because that's the whole point. There is political alliances, there is national interest, there is party interest. Some are very partisan and they care about their own political party or their own benefit that's connected through some political connections compared to national interest, or it could be religion, whatever. But regardless of, that's why we have the responsibility to protect in place globally. It's after we've learned so many times the Armenian genocide, the Congo genocide, the Jewish Holocaust, Bosnia, Serbia. We've learned so many times, and we failed, and we came up with the never again promise. But again, we are bogged down with jurisdiction, with political alliances, with strategic moves. But I think we should draw the line, like you said, when it comes to genocide, when it comes to crimes against humanity. That's why we really should put our differences aside and just really say no. And that's
yeah
exactly what goes on. The reason why I got involved. I'm not political scientist by trade. I'm a researcher of biosecurity. But it's because I was compelled to expose what's going on, the genocide against Tamaris in Ethiopia. But then through that, also looked at what was going on across the globe. And I think, like you said, if we could just prioritize that bit, there
mm-hmm.
is not a solution, the same solution for every problem in the world. But like you said, when it comes to genocide, if we could prioritize that, I think we would do a lot more as humanity, all in all, as citizens of the earth. So, Aidan Simardone, thank you so much for being my
Of
guest,
course,
and I hope to talk to you and in on other issues in the future. But
of course.
really, thank you very much. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.